Bord Energy, proud sponsors of the GAA All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship and GAA Legends Tour Series of Croke Park. Hashtag hurling to the core.
Hello and welcome to the Tyrone Independent.ie's GAA podcast in association with Bord Energy. I'm Will Slattery, delighted to be joined as always by Michael Verney. Michael, hello.
How's it going, Will?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Another dramatic football semi-final weekend, extra time thriller once again. And we have a very novel final pairing. I know Mayo have been in there a good few times over the last few years, but they've never played Tyrone in an All-Ireland final. So it's sure to be an interesting matchup.
Yeah, definitely. But Tyrone only have 3 in their history and Mayo haven't won one in 70 years. So it doesn't get much more novel than that. I think it's probably, from a public point of view, it's probably a final kind of the people were crying out for in many ways. Like there's so many different ways of looking at this. It's not like, I think it was an All-Ireland quarter final maybe 5 years ago, maybe was one of the last times they met in championship. So yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting final and it's very fresh. You know, everyone was talking about, you know, we were looking at a Dublin team going for 7 in a row this year and they weren't even favourites to win the All-Ireland because Kerry were favourites based on what we'd seen throughout the league, and all of a sudden neither of the two of them are in the final. So it's definitely a very, very novel pairing.
Yeah, obviously with Dublin winning 6 in a row, it's obviously been very predictable in one sense. But even though Dublin Kerry matchups do get like a lot of attention and they are great, yeah, there is something intriguing and interesting about Mayo and Tyrone. Obviously, we're going to get a new All-Ireland winner who hasn't won it for a number of years. Mayo, as you mentioned, a lot longer. But yeah, the football championship has kind of been crying out for a kind of a fresh pairing in a final, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely, and it's been crying out for 2 big semi-finals like we got. We'd had very little really competitive, exciting action up in the list, and all of a sudden we didn't just get 2 70-minute games. We got 2 extra time games that were like in it right till the last play, as it was yesterday anyway. And I think this is exactly what we needed, just to re-energize the whole football championship.
Yeah, well, it was a busy weekend in the Camogie Championship as well, and we're going to talk to Ursula Jacob a little later on about those semi-finals, Cork and Galway coming out on top. But first, we have to reflect on that absolute thrilling game on Saturday night in Croke Park. We're going to be joined in a couple of minutes by Dick Clerkin, but first, Mayo legend Cora Staunton is joining us on the Tyrone podcast in association with Bord Energy for the first time. Cora, how are you?
Not too bad now, Will. Good. Looking forward to 2 weeks' time, Mayo Tyrone. As you said, a very novel pairing. You know, not what a lot of people would have expected at the start of the year. I suppose Dublin and Kerry were the 2 favourites to make the final. So, yeah, looking forward to the build-up now for the less than 2 weeks. But, yeah, a smashing game again, another great semi-final at the weekend. So, as I said, it's going to be a super final.
Yeah, and from a Mayo perspective, you know, we'll get to the maybe match in a bit more detail in a minute. But, you know, are you happy with this matchup? Would you prefer Kerry, or are you happy that Tyrone prevailed ultimately?
Yeah, it's a question I suppose a lot of Mayo people are asking after Saturday evening's game. It's very hard to know, the way the intensity and the hunger and the ferocity that, you know, Tyrone brought to the game. To me, they were deserving winners in normal time. And Kerry were probably lucky to get it to extra time. I thought Tyrone were the better team right throughout. So, yeah, from a Mayo point of view, I don't think they would have thought they were expecting Kerry to beat Tyrone. I think they were just going in to see who their opponents would be. But, I just thought Tyrone's energy levels, their work rate, their hunger, their organisation, it was top drawer. I just think Kerry looked lost at times and probably barred their 2 stars in Clifford and O'Shea in the forward line, and especially David Clifford. I think Kerry would have struggled a lot more. So, yeah, it's difficult from a psychological point of view for Mayo. It's probably better that it's Tyrone rather than Kerry, because obviously we've had All-Ireland final baggage with Kerry in years past, and I know a lot of the time these things don't affect the players of nowadays, but, from a supporter's point of view, I think it's good to see that it's Tyrone and, they're excited, and 2 counties that, are mad about their GAA. So, yeah, it's going to be a great All-Ireland final. The build-up, obviously the tickets for the next 10 days, are, that's going to be the talk. Everyone trying to get to be one of the 40,000 people there. But I think it's going to be a great final. I think it's going to be a huge tactical battle. Horan is very shrewd the way he operates, and Dooher and Logan are exactly the same. The way they set Tyrone up yesterday, their organisation was immense, and I think it's going to be a very difficult final for Mayo.
Yeah, Michael, what's the bigger story for you today, with a couple of days removed from the game? Is it Tyrone causing the upset after, the kind of turmoil of the last couple of weeks, or is it Kerry as All-Ireland favourites? A lot of people had already written them into a final, being upset, and for the third year in a row in a game where they probably could have come out on the right side of the result, ultimately losing. What's the bigger one for you there?
No, Tyrone is the story for me, just because of everything that was going on in the background leading up to the game. I'm actually living in Dunboyne in Meath here, and there must have been staying in Dunboyne Castle, because there was red shirts all around here on Friday evening, and it's mad to think like they'd been probably hibernating for weeks before that, and then they were back out and about again, and just the energy that they were able to bring to the table the other day. Like, this was a classic Tyrone performance. This was, I know the lads brought it up on the Sunday game last night. Like, there were so many instances that you could just basically have a split screen between 2003 and 2021. Just the amount of bodies that were getting in everywhere. And the amount of willing runners, both in attack and in defence, lads that were just, going the extra mile to get back in and be the third man in around a Kerry player. You just felt there was openings that Kerry had at times, and, a hand pass went into, just say, Shawnee O'Shea or David Clifford, and all of a sudden there was just guys swarmed around them. The want that they had just to, put Kerry under pressure, put them off balance, do anything they could, even with Tommy Walsh's shot at the end. There was no way Ronan McNamee wasn't going to get his body in there and at least force him to be off balance shooting. So I have to say, I do think Tyrone was a story. I think Tyrone were massive odds going into that game. I'm not sure why exactly. Like, if you look at the league game, they shipped 6 goals, and that's the most they've ever shipped or whatever. But they had a massive point to prove, and were able to turn things around. And that's to me that's the story. And even just while they're playing similar to how they did under Hart, it's probably just the abandon maybe up front, that they're willing to go the extra pass to try and get in for a goal, that they have someone like Conor McKenna who just will not take the conservative option ever. He'll always, even at the end, to win that 45, even though Morgan put it wide. Like in previous years, they would have just looped back around and tried to hold on to the ball, but he had I suppose it's kind of a bit of a freestyle kind of nature to him, that he wants to go in and wants to try and force things to happen. And in fairness, Tyrone made things happen all over the pitch on Saturday. And while it was a different type of semi-final maybe to the Dublin Mayo one, and maybe the quality maybe at times wasn't as good, it was just pure drama till the very end. And even Tyrone didn't score in the second half of extra time. They were kind of just hanging on. And it took Kerry until the last 10 minutes of extra time for them to probably figure out how to beat Tyrone. And it was too late at that stage. But just, seriously courageous performance from Tyrone.
Well, Cora, as Michael went through some of the things Tyrone did well against Kerry. From a Kerry perspective, do you think they were surprised with how strong the performance was, given all the COVID questions? There was a lot of talk that, a lot of players were still feeling very fatigued. It's hard to know if that was a bit of gamesmanship, because they didn't look very fatigued. Certainly, considering it went to extra time, and they still finished pretty strongly. Like, do you think Kerry were a bit shell-shocked with the intensity Tyrone brought, given that build-up?
Yeah, I definitely think they were shell-shocked. I suppose from like a psychological point of view, Tyrone had all the edge. They only them know how bad their COVID was and what effects it had on them. Obviously Kerry and the rest of the supporters and people that watch GAA were wondering what way would Tyrone come out. Would we miss some players? What condition their players in. So yeah, obviously from a Kerry point of view, a 5-week layoff. And in that 5 weeks, not fully sure if you're having an opponent. At one stage when Tyrone pulled out, we have an opponent and when the match is going to be played. So I'm sure they're training from that point of view. Wasn't as consistent as they'd like it, whether they'd give themselves some time off in that period because of the uncertainty of what were happening with Tyrone. But I think from a Kerry point of view, I think they were shell-shocked, but I just don't think it was a case in point to do with just COVID. I think it's what they've been through this year in the Munster Championship with Cork, a dour enough Munster final, bar the first 20 minutes where Cork, put it up to Kerry against Clare and even throughout the National League, their last National League game, obviously against Tyrone. It's all talk about the 6 goals, but they haven't had really too many intense battles right throughout the National League. And obviously the National League condensed this year. I think Dublin was the only one, and that was a draw. So they just haven't had too many intense, ferocious battles like that. And, championship, that's where it's obviously brought. So that's the first time it's hit them. And I just don't think they're ready for it. You think they know the style of Tyrone play. As Mike said earlier, it's changed a little bit from Mickey Hart's time, but it hasn't changed a huge amount. They're probably attacking a little bit more and playing a little bit more freedom up top, but they still bring a lot of bodies behind the ball and they're trying to counter-attack. So it was nothing new that they shouldn't be ready for, but I just don't think they're ready for the intensity and the frosty and the hunger and the work rate that Tyrone brought. And yeah, I think a lot of their players, as we said, bar probably Sean O'Shea, David Clifford, I think Thomas Sullivan had quite a good game, Gavin White. I think outside of them, probably 4 players, the rest of the Kerry players really froze on the day and didn't really perform to the levels they can. So, yeah, you have to give huge credit to Dooher and Fergal Logan for that, because the Kerry organisation, everyone knew what they were doing. Their tackling, their work rate. It wasn't that, one man would be tackling, the second man would come in and the third man come in, and they just dispossessed time and time again the amount of turnovers Kerry had as they drove right through the middle. They weren't getting through that, or that Tyrone defence, and Tyrone really pressed up on them around the middle third, and they just struggled with it, and they had no answers. And as Mike said earlier, I think it was probably second half of extra time that they figured out, and I think that was a stage when Tyrone were probably out on their feet to figure out, and this is the way that they should take on Tyrone, and it was a little bit too late. But I think credit goes to Tyrone. I think Peter Keane and their team went in a bit naive if they didn't know that the way that Tyrone were going to bring in the intensity they brought.
Well, we're delighted to be joined on the line now by Dick Clerkin. Dick, how are you?
Good morning, folks. How are you doing?
Yeah, no, thanks so much for joining us. Maybe, a couple of days removed now from the game, like, what are your overall thoughts? I know in today's Irish Independent you were kind of talking about the why of how Tyrone ended up upsetting Kerry. I know you discussed a bit about Kerry's failings as well. Like, what's your big takeaway now with a couple of days out from the game?
Well, looking back, I suppose if you were down in Kerry, if you're one of the players in the management, what's going on now, you're poring over what we could have done differently. Did we contribute to our own downfall in terms of decisions we made, personnel setup? And I think there is a case to be asked there from a Kerry point of view. I always obviously been a midfielder. I'm always looking at games from that point of view, and I still can't figure out how Kerry just adopted a short kick-out policy the way they did from the outset, especially how dominant they were on Tyrone's long kick-outs. Because if there's any team I thought would have went short on Saturday, it would have been Tyrone and tried to gain possession, whereas actually obvious from the outset that it was a policy for Tyrone and Niall Morgan. He boomed an awful lot of kick-outs, which you don't see that often now from teams down the middle. But I always understood from a midfielder point of view, if you want energy in your team, you want a bit of madness, you want a bit of franticness, there's no better place to get it, to bring it to the middle third and the breaking ball, because, and plus when you win ball out there, you're on the front foot straight away into attack. Yes, this focus on 100% possession from kickouts has its place, but you go back and look at Kerry's build-ups from all those short kickouts, slow, laboured, especially when Tyrone set out that they were meeting them in the middle of the pitch. And it was obvious that Tyrone were quite happy to give Kerry those short kickouts because they had a plan then to meet them far up the pitch and stop them. And it worked a treat. And that Kerry didn't change it around or try and say, right, put David Moore back in the middle of the field, drop a few balls on top of him, try and get a bit of energy around the breaking ball, fast ball into the forwards. I just couldn't believe that they didn't try that over the course of the 90 minutes.
Just on that, Dick, that's basically another example of how Tyrone basically set the rules of engagement, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. And like when you can see that happening, Tyrone had a very, very clear game plan to say, and I know Tyrone, everyone's saying, actually, we knew we were going to win. Rubbish. Tyrone were rank outsiders for good reason, but they had bought into a plan that was everything in terms of personnel, where those people would be and what they were going to allow Kerry to do or not to do. And one of those things we're going to let them take the short kick out. We know, look at the Tyrone's midfielders, 2 young, relatively inexperienced guys going up against David Moore, arguably one of the best fielders of the game over the last 10 years, and Jack Barry, who can compete aerially, but in terms of the game that they allowed them to play, they're not the 2 guys that you want having to play a running game or a roving game that Tyrone dictated. And it was noticeable how ineffective the 2 Kerry midfielders were from a forward play point of view. Not a shot between them. I don't remember seeing David Moore even crossing the midfield at any given point in time, where he actually, if you think about David Moore, fabulous kick passer off the ball. If he can get the ball in primary possession, can deliver. he done little or none of that because he was getting balls so far back. And listen, he's 34, 35 on a day like Saturday. For him to try and get up the pitch as well and deliver ball in, it was never going to happen, and it didn't.
And Cora, from a Kerry perspective now, how do they go on from here? It's 3 years with Peter Keane as manager and the majority of the management team in place. 3 relatively similar defeats in terms of, shot selection and decision making at the end of games, costing them dearly. Like, do you think it's time for a change in the management team?
Yeah, I do personally. I think it is. I suppose if you look at his record since he's come in, 2019 being their best year, and the year they probably should have beaten Dublin, the All-Ireland, obviously went to the replay at 2020 against Cork in the Munster final. From a Kerry point of view, that was just a really bad year, and the way they lost to that. And looking back on Saturday, their defeat to Tyrone and the way the manner they lost to it, they bet a poor Cork team in the Munster final. And I think it's time for a change. And even listening to Moss O'Shea on the Sunday game, he spoke about like they have a lot of nice footballers, and they're bringing through a lot of nice skillful footballers, and they don't have the footballers that maybe have that little bit of aggression and dirt in them, in previous years that they had. And I think they need to probably find more of them footballers. And I probably think Peter Keane has brought brought them to as far as he can, and I do think it's time for change. Yeah, they obviously have quality and they have underage coming through, but for Kerry not to have won an All-Ireland, and especially this year, they're going in as favourites, and with the Dubs obviously gone, a lot of Kerry people had thought this was the year once Mayo had beaten Dublin, and even before that. So yeah, I think it's hugely disappointing. They are a relatively young team when you take out a couple of their older players, the likes of David Moran, but from a Kerry point of view, and from certainly Kerry supporters' point of view, they won't be happy with what they've achieved over the last 3 years in Peter Keane's reign.
Yeah, Mike, because there's some interesting kind of statistics. Like, the Kerry's record in Croke Park over the last number of years has been very, very poor. I think they've only won one of their last 10 or so games. Obviously, you had all those minor All-Ireland wins. It's been 7 years without a senior All-Ireland, so that hasn't really translated. Obviously, Clifford and O'Shea and Tom O'Sullivan are some of the guys who have kicked on, but there's 45, 50, 60 players who won minor All-Irelands, and that's not maybe the greatest return there. So it's an interesting period for Kerry football. There was maybe an expectation that the All-Irelands would just naturally flow, but as we've seen with other famous underage teams, maybe that Limerick hurling 3 in a row at under 21 in the noughties, it doesn't always translate. It's very difficult to actually make that breakthrough sometimes.
Yeah, and I suppose people thought it was probably a year too early for Kerry in 2019, and you're looking at 2 years later, and been beaten in a Munster final and an All-Ireland semi-final, haven't actually been back to the big day yet. And I suppose a lot of it, when you look at the past 3 years, is how their probably inability to deal with pressure when it was really put on. And that was, they were a man up in that 2019 All-Ireland final. The first day out looked like they had it in control, and all of a sudden I don't think they got a shot away for the last 12 minutes, and they were dominated the second day. The Munster final last year, there were massive favourites going into that game, didn't deal with that, got a bit of a sucker punch at the end, and again massive favourites going in last Saturday again, and they were turned over, and could have been turned over in normal time, but were turned over eventually in extra time. So it's an interesting one. I would agree with Cora in that, like, if anything, like, they're not getting any closer to an All-Ireland than they were in the first year. So I do think probably it is time for change. Like who exactly comes in, I wouldn't be sure exactly where to look. And Keane would have been the obvious candidate, having been with the minors. I don't know if there's any really obvious outstanding candidate. Maybe someone like Jack O'Connor would potentially come back for a third reign, but he's obviously committed to Kildare, so it's hard maybe to see that happen. So it'd be very interesting what direction they go in. I think Peter Keane probably maybe lost some support when whatever happened with Donny Buckley, and Donny Buckley subsequently ended up in Monaghan. I definitely think that played a part and potentially could have undermined his reign a small bit. But it's going to be really interesting to see where they go from here. But I would be surprised if Keane was the man in charge next year. Who is going to be the person in charge? It's very, very hard to say though.
Yeah, Dick, it's an interesting position where the obvious candidates are maybe guys who've done the job before and who left in circumstances that maybe weren't the most positive. Eamon Fitzmaurice obviously left after 2018. He was getting a lot of abuse from Kerry supporters. Jack O'Connor left after a couple of years where they didn't win the All Ireland. So it's not as if there's an obvious candidate or a really exciting candidate for even supporters to get behind.
No, and it is easy to just say, yeah, Keane, too many mistakes on the line over the last couple of years, stepped somebody in. Like, take a step back. They were very poor. It wasn't a case, so like on Saturday, they didn't have to do an awful lot more playing badly to win that game, and they're still favourites. And I would fancy they would have beaten Mayo. So they're not as far off as so. But to strip out a management team, to go back to the drawing board, that can put you back quite a way because the continuity that you have. So it might seem like the right thing to do, but as you said, like I always say, the analogy of going to a junior B game and your boy shouting from the stand at the corner forward, get him off. I says, yeah, but wait till you see what's on the bench to come in. They're not that far away if they actually just face up and own the mistakes that they've made and try to improve on that. Like the players have to take a bit of ownership as well in terms of their level of application and simple things like Darragh Moynihan been shown up. I mentioned just getting knocked out at the first hit. Obviously totally unprepared for what Croke Park is, and contributed to letting Colin Mayer. Like simple things like that's not really in Peter Keane's control. And those players are still going to be there for a new manager coming in. So I think there's an element to, like, unless there's a really good replacement coming in and there's a real appetite from the players and everybody there, I think you could be going further back, to try and go forward as well. Whereas actually they just need to improve another 5-10% on where they're at, but be really honest about how they lost that game and don't be blaming the 5 weeks. And there was a bit of that which would annoyed me with Peter Keane and that they were making reference to it. I says that if they had a problem with that, it was 3 or 4 weeks ago. The minute the game was agreed to be played, that was it. It was about the game on the day and park everything else. But in terms of on the day, there was questionable decisions made that they have to own and try and improve on them, which I think they can. I think they can. But to start afresh, can lose a lot of momentum as well. And they did have momentum. They did have momentum going into that game. Like they have had good form. So you could undo a lot of good work at the same time by trying to start a game.
Yeah, no, it'll definitely be an interesting few weeks to see what Kerry decide to do. But from a perspective going into the final, Cora, Tyrone have a 2-week layoff, Mayo will have a 4-week layoff. So it's kind of somewhat similar to what Kerry were facing into. Like, has this COVID situation ultimately worked, in Tyrone's favour now that they only have 2 weeks to wait? They'll be battle hardened. They've had a tough journey through Ulster as well. Do they have a slight advantage there, do you think?
Yeah, it's very difficult to know. I think 2 weeks is quite a tight time. That was in a very intense game, extra time again, and going back to the whole COVID situation, players that maybe had it, the recovery period, will probably need to be over the next few days. Then they have only, the weekend relay to get ready for Mayo, where I think Mayo certainly needed the 4 weeks after their victory against Dublin because of the injuries they had, again, because of the ferocity of the game. And for a county like Mayo, on the high of beating Dublin after that game, probably took maybe a couple of days, if not a week, for that hype to go away. As I said earlier, it's probably, it's very calm down here now, but it'll obviously build towards the All-Ireland. So I do think 2 weeks for Tyrone, they will have momentum going in, and obviously Mayo have the longer layoff. I think 2 weeks is just on the cusp of being very tight, depending on how their players are, injury-wise this morning. I know they hadn't any major injuries coming from Saturday evening, but, just how people have pulled up after the game, they'll have to use the earlier part of this week for recovery. And obviously then, they have what after that, maybe 10 days or less then to prepare and get ready for Mayo. So, yeah, it can have, it's pros and cons for both teams. I know certainly from a Mayo point of view, they certainly needed the 4 weeks. But yeah, Tyrone have massive momentum. They've been through a very difficult campaign, obviously, in Ulster. But I suppose the 5-week period that they had off, through the Ulster final and the All-Ireland semi-final and the COVID period probably gave the, players that maybe didn't have COVID the time to rest up as well. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting battle. As I said, it's going to be a great final. And as I said, a novel pairing, having come up against each other in All-Ireland final, it's going to be so interesting. I just can't wait for it.
Michael, one thing I'd like to get your thoughts on just before we wrap up our football discussion is, the whole COVID controversy. Brian Dooher in his post-match press conference was quite pointed about it, talking to the media, saying, there's some accusations that we tried to, pull a bit of a stroke or pull a fast one. That's completely untrue. And he kind of walked out, I think, for reading Donegal Boyle's piece in today's Irish Independent and left Fergal Logan to finish it off. So it's obviously something they've been potentially using to build that kind of mentality in the squad, a siege mentality, which we know in the past served them very well. But how do you reflect on that whole episode? Because obviously Brian Dooher was still very keen to bring it up towards the end of that press conference.
Yeah, well, I think it's bound to be still brought up by journalists and even by normal punters, because I still don't think we have all the answers on the table for us. So we don't have all the facts on the table, and we might never have the facts on the table. So it was always going to be a massive point of discussion after the game, and it's not going to go away now. And if Tyrone win the All Ireland, it'll probably be called the COVID All Ireland. That's just that's the way it is. But they definitely, nobody does the siege mentality probably like Tyrone. I remember someone saying to me once that you need to be balanced in life. You need to have a chip on both shoulders, and they definitely had a chip on both shoulders the other day. And they brought that. The siege mentality thing only works to a point. It can't be. There has to be more to you than just that. But it might get you over, a big day, and it might just give you that little extra kick that's needed on that day. Don't think that none of that will, play any part really in the final, because it's a completely different game. But it's just mad. It was almost a perfect storm for them if their guys were back to full health, and they certainly looked like they were back to full health the other day. If anything, there were Kerry bodies dropping left, right and centre all over the pitch. There weren't her own bodies dropping. Niall Morgan was helping 2 or 3 different guys with cramp. It wasn't the opposite way around or anything like that. But I think COVID is always going to be referenced with regards to that game and potentially the whole season if they do win it. That's just it's unprecedented scenario. That game was put back 2 weeks, and then the All Ireland was put back a couple of weeks as well. So it's only natural that it's going to be talked about. But it definitely does look like they used it to fuel them to add a bit of extra momentum to their effort, and it definitely didn't do them any harm anyway.
I think I might give you the last word then. Do you want to come in on what they've been talking about there?
Yeah, I think from a mental or a psychological point of view, I think it's all in Mayo's favour now. Whereas, going into that game at the weekend, it was very much in Tyrone's favour. As you said, you already referenced the siege mentality and that sort of go for broke. Let's see what we can get out of ourselves. There's a real freshness and freedom to play like that when there's no expectation. Whereas you flip that around, look at the pressure that Kerry were under and how that impacted on them. That's now on Tyrone. I'm actually up in Tyrone in Ardbow in the Wagon country here at the minute. Even now, driving up through the county, there's hardly a flag up. They're slow getting out to support their team. I don't even know was Croke Park at the 25,000 at the way. There seemed to be a smaller crowd than there was at the Mayo. So they're only starting to get back and believe in this team. And now everyone's buzzing because they didn't believe that they were able to turn it around. But now they have to deal with expectation. They have to deal with that pressure of hype that they hadn't any of. Mayo have had to deal with it, but I'd say James Horan walking out of Croke Park on Saturday delighted that he wasn't having to play Kerry. There's no baggage with Tyrone. They were able to beat good Tyrone teams in the past and have no fear of them, never have. And 2 weeks, Cora mentioned it, whatever, but obviously from a COVID point of view, there was no material impact physically on the guys that they put out. There's no way you put in the shift that they did and have it's actually the opposite. They look fresh, they look rested, whereas Kerry were probably training away at trying to keep themselves busy with in-house games, whereas the boys were. There's another discussion about strength and conditioning and team preparation when you can see how Tyrone were able to perform with the impact that they had. Now, at the same time, that'll take them a good while to recover from. They're really only going to be recovering ice baths, swimming pools, getting back out into the pitch. That coupled with the psychological impact, it'll be a massive, massive challenge for Tyrone to deliver that same level of performance in 2 weeks' time. So I think it's the ball is in Neil's court.
And it's set up to be absolutely mouth-watering final matchup. But for the moment, Dick, Cora, thanks so much for joining us. Well, it was semi-final weekend in the Camogie Championship, and we were left with a very exciting final matchup after Cork beat Kilkenny by 15 points to 111, and Galway saw off tip by 113 to 12 to set up a Cork-Galway final. And we're delighted to have Ursula Jacob on with us this morning to discuss the two games. Ursula, how are you?
Not too bad, thanks.
Cork-Kilkenny has probably been the defining rivalry in the Camogie Championship over the last number of years, and we were treated to another thrilling game over the weekend. It kind of went back and forth. It looked like Cork were in the ascendancy, then Kilkenny got back on top, and then Cork, I think, hit the last 3 points to come out the victors. What stood out to you, kind of how they wrestled back the initiative in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, typical Cork-Kilkenny game where, it ebbed and flowed, and I felt that Cork were in full control in the first half in particular. I think they dominated most of the sectors, but we were kind of looking for that little bit of a kick or spark in Kilkenny. And in fairness, we did get that in the third quarter. That Mary O'Connell goal kind of lifted Kilkenny's spirits. But all credit to Cork, they did respond so well to that. Kilkenny even went ahead for the first time. I think it was the 51st minute. And Cork didn't panic. And, sometimes when a team that has so many maybe inexperienced players, included in the team, you're thinking maybe they'll falter or they'll, lose the heads or whatever. But in fairness, they got some vital scores and obviously got that crucial winning score from Linda Collins. And she made a big impact off the bench. And, they were probably unlucky not to get a goal for that red card incident on Orla Cronin as well.
Yeah, Michael, I know you were there covering for the Irish Independent. It's funny, these Cork-Kilkenny games always seems to go down to the wire, usually only a point in it. What stood out to you?
Yeah, it did look like Cork were the better team the whole way through the first half, particularly in that second quarter. Chloe Sigerson was firing over points from everywhere, and they were 10-5 up. And Orla Cronin actually missed a free in the 43rd minute. It would have put them, was it second now? Yeah, in the 43rd minute, it would have put them 5 up. And all of a sudden then Denise Gall gets a free and Mary O'Connell gets a goal, and Kilkenny are back level. And you're just thinking, Kilkenny haven't been playing well for 60 minutes this year. They've been kind of playing in fits and starts, but you kind of thought that they were coming perfectly at the right time to go 2 points up and Katie Power over a point after a goal free in the 52nd minute, and you're thinking this is only going one way. And then all of a sudden Cork are able to wrestle back the momentum, and a lot of it was that they've been playing a real kind of high energy running game, a kind of a possession game where they were trying to play the ball around and there was always girls running off the shoulder. I think crucially they didn't abandon it when the pressure was really on them, and they stuck to that, and they got 3 great scores then to finish it off. And Linda Collins been left off as captain as well was a big call for management to make, and Paddy Murray said after that the reason she was left off was that they felt they needed a kick off the bench. They hadn't had a kick maybe last year when Kilkenny were the ones that edged them, I think, by 2 points last year, and she definitely gave them that kick when it was needed. But it was real dramatic stuff, like Cork had what looked like a clear goal chance there, for Katrina Mackey's goal chance, and then all of a sudden, crucially, the ball was recycled and it went over the bar, but then Orla Cronin was sent off and they were down to 14, and it was just a really, really dramatic last few minutes. But midway through the last quarter, it looked like Kilkenny's game. They were just starting to get into it, and some of their big players are starting to get into it. But I think Denise Gall picked up, I don't know if it was a finger, and she was getting attention to her, what looked like her knee and her finger, and she was definitely hindered in the last couple of minutes as well. And in fairness to Cork, they just stuck with what they had been doing really, really well at different stages of the game, and they just saw it out. But yeah, there's always drama when these two meet, and last night was definitely no different.
Yeah, and it was funny just reading Paddy Murray's comments after the game. He was very quick to paint them as massive underdogs, he said, going to the final. He's saying that people are saying it's Galway's All Ireland to lose. He was talking them up as a much deeper team in terms of talent on the bench as well than maybe Cork are. Galway obviously beating Tipperary by 4 points. Are Galway as good as Paddy Murray is saying, or is he playing kind of a bit of mind games?
Look, it wouldn't be an interview without Paddy potentially playing some mind games. Look, at Cork are a very confident team, wants to get to Croke Park, and Croke Park suits this Cork team down to the ground because, as Michael just alluded to, the whole thing about Cork is their running game, their possession game. They're brilliant, hurlers and very, very skillful, but they're also able to match that with athleticism, and they'll be going in very confident into that final, because getting over Kilkenny yesterday was a big win for them. They had lost the last two All-Ireland semi-finals by a point and 2 points to Galway and Kilkenny the last 2 years. And they were really, really, huge disappointments for Cork, because Cork don't consider it a successful year, like any Cork team, unless they win an All-Ireland. And for them not to be in an All-Ireland final since 2018 was a big thing for Paddy. And it's probably one of the reasons why he probably stuck with this team, because he knew the potential. Cork at underage level, they've won the last 3 minor All-Irelands. They're in this year's minor All-Ireland. They've got that kind of talent pool coming through. And in fairness, Paddy is stuck with him. But Paddy is going to go into that final feeling massively confident. Cork's record against Galway in All-Ireland finals in recent years has been really impressive. I was looking back this morning, and the last time Galway beat Cork in an All-Ireland was 1996. And Cork have beaten Galway 4 times since then. So Galway are going to have a huge battle on their hands, but they will be happy that they got over a kind of dogged performance from Tipperary. They didn't fire at all cylinders, but look, there's no point in playing your best game in the semi-final and then having nothing to improve on for the final.
There must be a bit of Kerry blood in Paddy Murray, because there was he was the only one in Croke Park that believes that Galway's name is written on it. That's a 50-50 game going into the final, and Galway haven't been lighting it up this year either. I think Cork come in with massive momentum. I think that's a big monkey off their back, as you're saying. There's a lot of they have a lot of experience retired in recent years, be it Breach Corkery or be it Rena Buckley, or there's plenty of Orla Cotter's no longer involved as well. There's lots of players that they have lost in recent years, so I think that's a huge monkey off their back. Whether Orla Cronin's going to be available enough for the final is a huge one, though, because they're a reliable free taker. You probably say Chloe Sigurdsson could probably maybe step in and take the ones closer to goal, but whether she's going to be available for the final or not is going to be interesting. And it's the same in the other semi-final as well. There was a red card coming out of that, so that's going to play. What goes on in the boardroom over the next couple of weeks is going to play a big part in deciding where the title goes too.
Yeah, it seemed like there could have been a case of mistaken identity potentially with the Galway red card, which would be interesting to see if that's straightened out. But one interesting thing I thought, Ursula, on Galway was manager Cathal Murray's comments after the game, talking about the 4-week gap that his side had versus Tipperary getting a run out, in the quarterfinal. He was kind of giving out that, what's the incentive of winning your group if you're on ice then for such a long period of time, and the other team gets a chance to maybe get a little more battle hardened. Do you agree with his point there?
Yeah, I think it is a strange one that there is a month-long break. I think a month is too long between, competitive games. Obviously, when you top your group, you want to go the direct route. And I think Galway and Cork would have been most happy with that. But Galway, on the other hand, I think Cathal Murray and his management team would be happy, on the other hand, that they've had the last month. They've really been dogged with injuries this year. Obviously, Heather Cooney is gone with a cruciate injury from a league game earlier on the year. But Carrie Dolan, who was missing yesterday, I would feel that she probably will be back fit for the final. But the likes of Niamh Hannafy, Orla McGrath, Teenie Cormac, and those 3 girls were all injured during the group stages of the championship this year. So I feel that probably Galway will be happy enough that they've had a month where the likes of those girls have been able to get a little bit of training under their belt and to recover from some of these injuries. Because if they had game after game after game, they wouldn't have had any chance of getting back. Whereas you saw yesterday the impact of Orla McGrath. She got 1-2. She was threatening every time in that full forward line, but she has been really struggling with a shoulder injury this year. So she would have been a huge loss for Galway if she wasn't there.
And Michael, just on Tipperary, I think it's their 4th semi-final defeat in a row, albeit I think this was the first time they've been pretty competitive and maybe been in with a chance of winning it. But it's still not nice to go down at the penultimate hurdle 4 years in a row. No,
they've been knocking on the door, and they are getting better and better every year. Bill Mullaney is obviously what he's doing down there is working. It's just the gap between the top 3 and the chasing pack. It's definitely getting smaller. But those top 3 teams, just chatting to Brian Dowling after the game yesterday, and kind of just said to him, it's disappointing how maybe that you weren't able to kick on, having been beaten in a couple of All-Ireland finals. And he said, he acknowledged that, but he also said, it's literally a point, 2 points between Cork, Kilkenny, Galway on a given day, and they are a step ahead of the chasing pack. Now, Tipperary have definitely closed that gap. I think they were beaten by 6 in All-Ireland semi-final last year, but probably always at arm's length. They were beaten by 4 yesterday, probably with a soft goal. There was probably no more than a score in between them and Galway yesterday. So they're definitely closing the gap. It is a bit demoralising, obviously, when you keep getting bet in semi-finals, but they are getting closer and closer every year. In fairness, it's the same result, but the performances are getting better, and their graph is still going up and up.
And Ursula, then just looking ahead to the final, who does have the edge at this point for you? As we've said, Paddy Murray thinks it's Galway, but what do you think? Do you think Cork have a strong chance of winning back the All-Ireland title?
Yeah, I wouldn't pay too much heed to Paddy saying that it's Galway's. Galway know it'll be a huge challenge. I would feel, if I was probably saying now at the moment, I think it's going to be a close game. I definitely agree with Michael. There'll probably be only very little between the two teams, a point or two, but I think Cork and Croke Park, I think they know how to win there, and I think maybe their athleticism, some of the mix between the youth and the experience. You've the Aisling Thompsons and these kind of girls around the middle of the field, and Hannah Looney, and then Amy O'Connor are so effective in the forwards. I just think maybe they've the momentum going in. I think that win yesterday against Kilkenny was such a psychological boost to this Cork outfit, but if Orla Cronin's not available, she will be a massive loss to the Cork attack and to the overall team. But I'd still probably slightly tip Cork for the final.
Well, the finals have been very tight affairs over the last number of years, so hopefully we get another exciting one this year. For the moment, Ursula, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem.
That's all we have time for this week on the Tyrone podcast in association with Bord Gáis Energy. We'll be back next week with another show. And in the meantime, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or listen on independent.ie. So until next time, thanks for listening and goodbye.
Bord Gáis Energy, proud sponsors of the GAA All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship and GAA Legends Tour Series of Croke Park. #Hurling to the Core.